So when I talk about clipping, what I mean is that you're essentially shifting where your blackest black is in the image. And when you're done with that, you're kind of, if you notice your histogram here, you're now changing what that black point is and what that white point is. And clipping is just a term used to say that you're discarding all the other information at kind of the other end. So if you were to say take a photograph and it's a really bright day and there's a really broad dynamic range, your camera just can't capture it, and you expose for your foreground, which is say a house with a lawn, and you expose for that, and your highlights are now blown out. Another way of just saying your highlights being gone or blown out is your highlights are clipped. And that means that your histogram is now, let's say, this information falls off and you've lost things in your image. So here, my highlights are now clipped. And so it's, again, a term used flexibly. And so with this adjustment layer, I'm not discarding any of this information, but I can still say that these areas are clipped because I can see that I have this information here. Does that make sense? Okay. And instead of using these points, if you wanted to instead tell Photoshop to kind of auto-select where these items should be, you can use the eyedropper tools on the far left-hand side. So the one on the top is going to be your black point. The one in the middle is going to be your midtones, your grays, and that'll also, if you notice, it affects your white balance. And the last one is going to be your highlights. And so each time you select one of these, it's going through and pushing kind of this information around. And they don't necessarily work all together. It's more you're setting each one up. So you can just set your midpoint region and not set the black point using the eyedropper tool. And then you can go in and customize that specifically.
So you grab that eyedropper and where do you use it?
So you click anywhere on your image. So this one is for your blacks. So if I were to choose this top one, I would want to click on the blackest point in my image.
Gotcha. Okay.
Hmm.
Now I'm beginning to understand. Do you do that? Do you set your black, white, and gray using droppers?
I don't like using the droppers.
Yeah.
I will generally just use the points at the bottom and use that threshold map to set those areas in my image.
And how does the threshold map work? It's you bring it until the clipping pattern disappears, or until
So when you're using that, it's essentially showing you where that information is starting to disappear. So I will bring it inwards towards when I just start to see a little bit of the image, and then pull it back out just a tiny bit. And so that basically I have clipped a little bit of my image. So whatever is kind of highlighted there in that pink tone,
it's not being lost.
it's now completely black.
Okay.
And that's something that I like to have pure black in my images. But again, if you want to avoid that and make sure you don't have anything too dark or too bright, then you want to make sure that your kind of point areas are way out and you can't see anything. And it's just going to be that.
And would you do the
color.
same thing with highlights? Would you try to bring something in the image into lose some of the highlight tones in order to bring the white point in?
Yeah.
And what does that do? That just gives you, that then gives you leeway on either side of your histogram as you do other adjustments?
So it's not actually giving you leeway, it's shortening the tones in your image. And so with your histogram, this is kind of a map of where all of your pixel information is. So here are your shadows, your midtones, your highlights. And what you're essentially doing is you're taking away that information from it. So I'm shortening the dynamic range of my image right now to something really, really small, rather than having kind of this full, broader spectrum. And it's, again, this is more of a tool that you're going to use differently depending on what effect you want. And generally, I go for a little bit of contrast because I'm shooting in camera raw. It tends to be kind of washed out sometimes. So that's why I'm bringing that range in just a little bit, is to have that kind of more contrast, a pure black and a pure white. But if you shot something that was, you want to avoid that, and you don't want pure black, then just make sure to keep these kind of broader rather than bringing them in too far.
So shortening the dynamic range is creating contrast.
Yes.
Do you see this thing here, the half moon? Click on it, and that gives you all these different things. And so what we're doing right now is we're doing these. So if you click on that, it will then create this, and that's demonstrated. And you see now it's in between your background and your top. You actually want it to be on the top, so just pull it up. And that was just because your cursor was there. Just pull it up again. There you go. Yeah. I know it's a little confusing sometimes until you get it.
Yeah.
So
It's essentially what.
I got all that.
Oh, you did?
This is the part that I wasn't. Okay, good. Thank you.
please feel free to interject and let me know if I'm moving a little too fast. So another thing that I wanted to mention about levels here is this kind of output level bar on the bottom. And what all that's doing is changing where you're telling Photoshop your black and your white is going to be. So here you're kind of telling it, okay, this is where in my image the blackest black is going to be. But if I wanted my blackest black to not actually be black, then I would just pull that up. You notice it's starting to get this kind of like faded tone, and it's matching what tone it is on this kind of graduated gradient scale. So it works the same way with the highlights. If I wanted the image to be darker and actually I want my white to look gray, then no matter where I'm pulling my highlight into my image, the whitest white is going to be that tonal range.
What do you call that bar there? Like what adjustment is that?
That would be your output level. And here, if you know the specific number that you want it to be, then you can kind of put that in there. So let's say I wanted to make sure that my whitest white was at 245, so I would just type that in. Did Carlos talk to you guys about color values at all? Or no? No? Okay. So essentially, with your image, because it's made up of, we were talking about 8-bit, 16-bit, that color depth, each color has a specific kind of red, green, and blue value. So if you ever kind of see these numbers, or someone might say, oh, my highlights never go past 245 or something like that, that's what they're referring to, is that specific color depth and channel number. So we'll talk about this more later on. If you want to access this right now, though, it's under the eyedropper tool. You want to right click and choose color sampler. And if you put a few dots down on your image, it's telling you in that secondary area that, okay, all of this has no information because that's 0. 0 is complete black. And the numbers before it are whatever your original image was. And the number on the right is always going to be whatever the most recent adjustment you've made to the image has been. But we'll definitely go into that more in depth later. I don't want to skip ahead that far. So another thing to be conscientious of when you're using any of these adjustment layers is that if you want to make an adjustment after you say you started making all these other ones and you want to go back to this, you do want to make sure that you're selecting this region here and not the layer mask, because sometimes if you click just the layer mask, it'll give you the information for the mask and not the actual information for the adjustment that you might want to be changing. But it's just a matter of kind of clicking over. Another thing that you can use in levels is if you want to use some presets. Another really easy thing to do, it just kind of, you're letting Photoshop make these decisions for you. But if you're having trouble kind of understanding what levels is doing, it's nice to kind of choose them and see where these numbers and values are going towards. So do you guys have any other questions on levels?
When you select a preset and it makes an adjustment, and then you want to go back to what it was before, would you go back to custom for it to revert back to what it was?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
So, moving on from levels, we're going to talk about curves really quickly, or actually much more in depth. You can access, again, any of these layer adjustments from 3 different ways. The most convenient way is to use this half dome kind of circle at the bottom. That's always going to be adding one of those adjustment layers. It gives you a full menu. I went ahead and changed my workspace. If you were in the default workspace, normally right here you'll also have those adjustments. So by changing that, it gave me libraries instead, but here I could just select adjustments. And it's the same thing as coming down right here. And it creates that layer for you. It just has those little symbols. If you hover over them, it'll tell you what each one is. The other thing I can do is go to image and then adjustments. And because I'm on a layer, adjustment layer right now, it's not giving them to me, but I can create a new adjustment layer from the top menu bar as well. So if you guys want to go ahead and create a new curves adjustment layer, and you can keep or discard the levels. So curves is essentially going to be manipulating all of that data we were just doing in levels the same way, but it just looks different. So here it's more of a linear kind of scale, and you see this line which represents pretty much this is your image, and then here are the tones in your image, and again it's just repeating that histogram. So you have more flexibility on what parts of the image you want to manipulate these regions of. So I'm going to start really, really simply just by placing a line, or placing a point on the center of the line here. And if you notice when I'm pulling it down or up, it's affecting pretty much starting from that midpoint region. And pulling it upwards is always going to go towards the highlights, and pulling it downwards is pulling it towards the shadows here.
Can you talk a little bit about what's different between curves and exposure?
Exposure?
Yeah.
So do you mean like exposure in camera or the exposure here?
I think the exposure there, like
There. So what's different about it is that this is an overall broad change. So if you notice, things are getting really dark and things are getting really light. But curves is actually giving you control to put multiple points down on your image and specifically just affect where that region is rather than a big broad change.
So so curves is like you have more control, but in essence it's the same thing. I mean, like exposure is just a broad brush, but is it? I guess that's my question. Is it like if you were to, I don't know, if the line were to be like flat and just go straight up, would that be the same as like an exposure adjustment?
So it's just, it won't quite work like that, because see, if you notice it goes to kind of pure white if I try and change that. You can use curves to make a broad adjustment, but again, it's really that flexibility. So you might achieve a similar look, and it's still manipulating the image data in its own way, but the ability for you to do it is increased in curves. Whereas exposure, here again, it's that broad type of change. Or if you notice, everything is getting brighter, everything is getting darker. But curves, now I can control what areas are getting lighter and darker. So to kind of, I guess, show you a little bit better, if I were to place a point here, that means now that the line is reactive. So if I place a point here and now I place a point here in my highlights, I can bring just my highlights up, and because it's flexible, now my shadows are getting darker. So I can either put a point down to kind of keep it steady, or I can leave that point and just have it be flexible. So it's kind of like you're balancing a seesaw versus just painting with a broad brush. Hopefully that cleared it up a little bit.
So if you did an exposure photo right when you're taking the image, would you go to exposure to get it to that point of where it should have been, and then use this to really fine tune the contrast and shadows?
So you can definitely use that exposure adjustment. In terms of workflow, using exposure in that Camera Raw plugin is just what I prefer, to kind of already have increased that exposure and then start manipulating the contrast here rather than having that extra layer. But if you want to do it just in Photoshop, then yeah, that's essentially what you could do. And so curves, it's working just like levels did, other than the fact that you can now place multiple points rather than just your white and your black, which is expressed both on the X and Y axis, or the X axis as well as the Y. You notice the one down here is similar to what we were doing with levels in terms of setting how black your black is. So if you notice here, these numbers again, input and output. You're changing where your black is, what is your white is white, versus here. So it's the same thing, just in a different visualized way. But the way you would use curves in order to increase, so let's just start with something like contrast. An S-shaped curve is what tends to give an image a slight pop. So this is a little extreme. I don't think this image really needs any of this, but that gentle sloping S is kind of your go-to in terms of adding contrast to an image. So you notice now my blacks are much blacker, my whites are much whiter, and I can use the eye to toggle those changes on and off. And so if I wanted to make it less extreme, I would bring it back to that dark gray line, which is telling me where my image originally, where those tones were. Now it's very subtle. Another way, instead of placing those images on the line, if that doesn't make sense, then that's completely fine. You can again use those eyedropper tools, and it will kind of do these things for you again, setting your white and setting your gray points. Right now, it's not, there we go. And again, they don't necessarily work in tandem with one another. Rather, you're switching all of these and they're making changes each individually. So you would want to choose just one generally when you're using these eyedropper tools rather than choosing and going through all of them. So the last way that you can really manipulate this line is by selecting this little hand with these two little arrows. And if you want, you can go to any point in your image or anywhere on your image. But right now I'm going to go to my shadows. And if you notice, it's showing me where on my tonal line that this region is. So I know that right here in this image is right down here. Here are my highlights over here. So let's say I wanted to make my blacks a little lighter. So I'm going to try and find my darkest black. So somewhere around here. Now I'm going to click down and I'm going to hold my mouse down, and now I'm going to pull it up because I want to increase detail in my shadows. So I can do it really extreme, so you can see that's what that line is doing. It's kind of going up on my x-axis, so I'm manipulating where my blackest black is, or I can bring it, it's already at its blackest point here, so pulling it down doesn't make it any darker, because it already is at black. If I wanted to make it lighter, I'd just be pulling up. And so you could do that at any point in your image. And that might help kind of understand what this curve is doing, kind of where all of your information sits on that line. So each time you click down, it adds a point to whatever region that is. So the other thing, with curves, it's just like levels in that you can manipulate each individual color channel as well. So if you thought your image was a little too warm and you wanted to kind of bring the overall amount of red down in your image, then you can click again that little hand and click onto an area and then pull down, and you notice it's going towards its opposite color. So it's going to be adding cyan into your image because you're taking red away. So if I want to increase the amount of red, now just pull up. And then so I think that using the hand is the easiest way to start to understand how curves works. But if you feel more comfortable playing around with putting points on here, by all means go for it. Just remember that this is your highlight region and this is your shadow region. And if you wanted to kind of achieve that split toning effect that we were doing in Camera Raw, this is one way to kind of get it to it very quickly, is by going into one of those channel colors and kind of adding a color into one region and having another color in the shadows. So right now, since I'm taking red away in my highlights and I'm pulling this line down, it's adding cyan to it, but it's leaving all that warmth in my shadows. So my line is still relatively straight. And again, you can also use any of these kind of presets as well. If I wanted to have really strong contrast, you notice that curve is very extreme, medium amount of contrast, it's a more gentle slope. It doesn't have that midpoint region selected because it's trying to balance out. If you imagine it more of, again, like a seesaw, it's trying to gently slope into the highlights. And then here is a very extreme kind of curve, S-shaped curve. Do you guys have any questions about curves? I can definitely go over it when we start next week, let it kind of sink in if you guys want to play around with it more. So other things and kind of go-tos that you'll be using a lot, most likely in terms of adjustments, other than those curves and levels, are going to be much more geared towards kind of color correction and again that hue, saturation, color balance. If you want to go ahead and create a new layer for hue and saturation, you're going to get the same type of toolbar that you'll see in Lightroom that we saw in the Camera Raw plugin. And again, here we're not dealing with any histograms, we're not dealing with any type of tonal curves. It's again just a sliding toolbar, and it works just the same way that we were working with things previously, except it's all kind of, I guess, compartmentalized into one palette rather than being spread out. So if you wanted to go into each individual channel, you would have to select it rather than having it show up for you. Here we have Vibrance, essentially doing the same thing as Vibrance was in Camera Raw, but it's not quite as flexible. You can't choose between individual color channels. It's again just one broad type of change. And then here we have the black and white, and again it's just like in Camera Raw. It's doing the same type of kind of effects where you can manipulate what's really coming out in your black and white image. I don't really know, can't translate that well. Instead of just discarding all your color information, if you have been using Photoshop before, played around with making black and white images, you can, under Image, go up to Mode and switch it to Grayscale. And it'll turn your image into black and white, but you're getting rid of any of that ability to kind of go in and really change the tonal regions.
So you said to go into the black and white, so let me just go back to this. I'm getting a message that's not something here. So you said go to where? Image, mode, grayscale?
Right. So that's a more destructive way of changing your image into black and white.
Because it'll say flatten or
So you can, if you want to go through that menu, just hit flatten. What flattening is saying is that it wants to compress all of your layers together, so then you don't have that ability to go back and change anything in there.
so I don't want to do that.
Right. If for any reason you need to discard that color information, then that's how you would do it. But I'm just, trying to say it's much better to use the black and white adjustment layer than to discard it.
That's the part I didn't get. Okay. Black, add a new layer, black and white.
So,
Is there a way,
yeah.
if you have made it black and white, is there a way like an alt key or something where you can, if you want to see where the reds are, for example, like is there something that brings the color back just for a second? If you're trying to tweak the colors.
So you can toggle it on and off with this the little eyeball, or you can use the eyeball down here. The other thing is you can change the opacity of the filter. So every layer has an opacity and a fill. They work differently. We can talk about fill a little bit later. But right now, just think about opacity. And it's essentially how thick the layer adjustment you're making will affect this bottom image. Or if whatever this layer is. No matter how many of these you have stacked on top of each other, it's always going to kind of affect how intense it's affecting the ones below it. So if I wanted to say create these really crazy levels, and it's really extreme, but I brought my opacity down, it's now only affecting my image by 20%. Or I could say 5%. And so if you're trying to get your image into black and white and you want to see that kind of where your color information is, you could bring it down to about 30 to 45% and then play around with these, and you'll see where in the image those colors are. Just as an aside, that's a trick I like to use a lot in order to make portraits seem a little bit more cinematic, is to actually have a black and white filter on there and kind of play around with these, and I'll just bring my opacity down just a little bit, and it kind of creates this mood to it that mimics film. I don't know if you guys can see on the screen.
Is that because it's layering like black and white on top of a color thing? And so you still have the color. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And so you'll do that like what would typically like 20%, did you say? Or
Within 10 to 20%, just depending on the image. So right now this one's on 15, and I guess to my eyes it makes it just feel more like it's film. Kind of increases those shadows there too a little bit. So other layer adjustments that you'll probably be using a lot when you're retouching images or doing any type of post-processing. Color balance is going to be the next one we're going to take a look at. And so, yeah.
Can I ask a black and white question before you move on to black and white? There's no like perfect black and white, but how would you make the best black and white from a color image on Photoshop?
Oof. Yeah, that is a tough question.
I mean, you yourself personally, like what would be the methods that you would use?
Right. I would really just get in depth with these kind of individual color channels.
That's so counterintuitive because, like, how do you know where there's color in black and white?
So essentially, so when I shoot black and white film photography, I use a lot of color filters. So I'm kind of used to already knowing where those colors are and what type of effect they're going to have on the black and white film. So if you were to say shoot something that was red with a red filter on it on black and white film, it would make it appear really, really dark. And so that's what you're essentially doing here is you're saying, okay, I want my reds to be really, really dark. So all the red tones in your image, it's almost as if you were shooting with a red filter on it. And so if I wanted her skin, since everyone kind of has a warm tone to their kind of skin, because, it's just, we've got all this blood underneath. If you want to manipulate the reds, that's what's going to affect mostly skin tones. Greens, if you have a lot of landscapes, that's what you're going to, greens, cyans, yellows. That's what's going to be coming out the most in your images. And again, it's just image by image. So if you notice, I really don't have a lot of blues in her face at all, other than her sweater. And if it's helpful to go to big extremes to see where those things are, I normally start with really broad changes and I always chisel inwards, just as a way to help me kind of see what's going on. So hopefully that answered your question. I'm sorry, I feel like it definitely is very specific to what your personal taste is in terms of like the perfect black and white image. So moving onward towards color balance, this is something that is not really available in your Camera Raw plugin, but something that you can use a lot to really add a sense of color grading or tone, something atmospheric to your images. And it works by splitting up your tones to either shadows, midtones, or highlights. And let's go ahead and just start in the shadows. So you can essentially, again, it's kind of like that split tone, but you have even more control over it. You can change the color tones in each of those regions. So if you wanted to, create that split tone effect, you could do that here, or just make all over broad changes. This is much more easy to kind of understand than making these changes in something like curves. You could do the same thing in both of these, but with curves, you do need to be thinking about the additive form of mixing color, versus with color balance, it lays it all out for you. So when I was learning Photoshop for the first time, this is how I learned to remember what that additive way of using color is. So essentially, if red and cyan go hand in hand, so in curves, if I'm in my red channel and I'm subtracting red, then I know it's going to add cyan. And so if you want to be making those broad color adjustments and you're not 100% sure what color is going to be added in when you subtract another one, that's how you can kind of use it as a cheat sheet, so to speak. So otherwise, color balance is really kind of self-explanatory since it is just a toolbar. Do you guys have any questions about it?
What's a common use, like just in your everyday kind of workflow that you would use color balance for?
So I normally use color balance for kind of tinting my images, so to speak, or giving them a specific feel. I don't use curves in order to do that because I feel like balancing things out is a little bit more complicated. Curves I will use for color correction versus color balance for adding and enhancing and doing color grading to the image. Another way that you can use it though is if your image is just a little bit too warm for your taste, you can balance that out with that as well. The only tricky part is that it's split between, you know, shadows, midtones, and highlights. So if it's a little warm in all of those areas, you have to kind of go through and do it for each one individually.
So just to say that, like, it more simply maybe, or
Yeah.
for me, is so curves is just like really basic, like color correction, like something's just off and you're just kind of getting it like back in line.
Mm-hmm.
But that you might use the color balance for more kind of aesthetic, artistic purposes.
Exactly. And that's the kind of complicated thing about Photoshop is that there's a million ways to do the exact same thing. And it's really about finding the tools that work best for you and kind of work best in your workflow. But yeah, there's a million ways to kind of, if an image is too warm, to change it. And another way to do that, the last one we're gonna, I think, look at for today in terms of adjustment layers is going to be the photo filter. So if you guys wanna, again, click on that little half moon and go towards photo filter. This one is an adjustment that's adding a kind of very broad change over your entire image. And it's essentially like you're either, again, shooting with a specific type of filter on top of your lens, or you can choose a specific color. So if I thought that my image was a little too red and I wanted to balance that out a little bit, I can choose the cyan filter. And this works similarly to opacity. Here it's called density though. And I can change how intense that is. So if it was just a little bit too warm, I could add a little bit of the opposite color all over the image to kind of correct for that. Or if I wanted to aesthetically use it, then it would apply just that color to everything in the image. Again, it's not breaking it down into any tonal regions. And instead of using any of these that are kind of presets, you can always just select color, and by clicking on that little square, it gives you your color picker dialog box. And so this is going to be the same across Photoshop. Whenever you're dealing with choosing a color, it's always going to look like this. And it's essentially giving you your full broad spectrum of colors. The white is always going to be in the far left-hand corner. Black is always going to be in the far right-hand corner. And you can click anywhere in here, and it's showing you what this new color you've selected is. So if I wanted something turquoise here, and all of these numbers, again, it's those specific channel values. That's what the RGB ones are for. Here, hue, saturation. Lab is a different type of color space. You don't need to really worry about it. And CMYK, if you were, say, doing this for something that's going to be like offset printed, or you need a specific Pantone color, then that's where you can type these in on these values, or this is your hex code down here. This is all information that's not, you really don't need to kind of know in order to use this, but I just want to let you guys know what all of these things are. So if you've ever used hex codes before, it's essentially a predetermined number and letter combination that's specific to a color value. And if you were, say, doing this for web, then you can specifically choose web safe colors. But that's beside the point. Let's see. So I would say those are generally the layer adjustments that you're going to be using the most when you're retouching. Everything else we can also talk about, but most of them are going to be things that people use, or designers will use when you're creating more graphic oriented things in Photoshop. But for right now, I think that's kind of a nice stopping point for us. And kind of, I want to open this up for any questions if I went too fast, or you want me to go over anything else again. No questions?
What would we do with all of the work that we did tonight? So would you, or is that?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Did you go over saving images at all, or saving PSD files from the last class? No? Okay, my mistake then. I'm sorry about that. I thought that was covered. So in order to save any of the work you did, or in general, any of these kind of adjustment layers, you want to save it either as a PSD file or as a TIFF file, and that's going to preserve all of these different layers that you've now created. So saving images in Photoshop, you want to start at the top toolbar and go to File, and then right in the middle region you want to click Save As, mostly because we don't want to save over this original file at all. We want to save it as a Photoshop document now, which is what that PSD stands for. So generally when I'm with my workflow, I will have a folder of just raw images and all my raw files in them, and then I'll have right next to it a folder that says working, and that's where I save all of my Photoshop adjustments. And from there, if I'm, say, exporting to the web or something like that, I'll have a third folder where it's just JPEGs. That keeps things really nice and tidy, especially when you have the same name for all of these files. But if that doesn't make sense to you, then I definitely encourage you to keep your files kind of together. So having your PSD, your JPEG, and your raw file all one after another. That would be another alternative way to organize it. But, so here we have our Save dialog box. Down here, there are 3 different ways you can save your Photoshop layers, one being a Photoshop document, the other one being a TIFF. And what a TIFF file is a lossless file format that isn't proprietary to the Adobe software. So saving something as a Photoshop file, you're restricting yourself to only being able to open that file up in either Photoshop or another Adobe program that supports it. If you are ever working with other people who might be using a different editing software, it's best to save things as a TIFF file because you're able to open it up again in different programs. So either of these would be fine for today. Since I only work exclusively in Photoshop in terms of photo editing, I normally save my files as a Photoshop file. Things like JPEG, they're not going to save any of your layers. So if you notice down here, you have kind of this option, and once you choose JPEG, it totally disappears. But here under Photoshop, I can either choose to save my layers or not save my layers. And it kind of has some fail-safe so that if I chose to save this file without my layers, then I can't overwrite my original file. I'd have to save it as a copy of this file. And if you wanted to save 2 different versions, that's also how you'd be able to kind of not overwrite anything. So to put it into a better example, if you had a Photoshop file that you were working on, you saved it and you opened it up the next day, made some changes to it, but you weren't sure if you were happy with them, you could just click Save as a Copy, and it will save it with the extension Copy at the end of it. And here with color, you always want to make sure that you embed your color profile. No matter what it is, you never want to discard any of that information. So after that, you can just hit Save, and it's going to tell you that normally this menu will always pop up when you're saving a PSD file. I would click Maximize Compatibility on, and again, it's kind of just referring to how Photoshop is going to compress the data when it's saving that file. I'm going to hit OK. And then here towards the bottom, if you ever are working on a really, really large file, you'll notice it saves fairly slowly. And this is just because the image is pretty large, but it's always going to show up here in this bottom left-hand toolbar, and again here at the top, kind of its progress.
Are you a Lightroom user also? Like, do you use that to organize your photos, or? So how do you? I'd be interested in knowing how you kind of work with the two together. Like, and because I'm getting to the point with, as you start to accumulate photos, like it was easy in the beginning, but then as you have more, it's kind of messy, and so I need
a way to consolidate it.
About like the workflow and structure of Lightroom and Photoshop. You had mentioned something about like the working folder and that sort of thing. But yeah, and do you ever go from Lightroom directly into Photoshop? Like do you I forget the smart like do you edit? Will you open up a Lightroom file
into Photoshop?
And then will you do that directly and as a smart file? Or?
So I generally don't, just because it never comes up in a way that kind of I need to in my workflow. So when I use Lightroom, I'll use it mostly when I'm working with, an event I shot or with a client or something like that. And in terms of like organizing things, let's see. So normally I'll have all of this in a Lightroom folder. I guess this is a bad example. And then from there, I keep all of my Lightroom information by itself. And then I'll have the original folder with all of my raw files. Now this one's actually very messy. I'm not going to show this one to you guys. So is that one. I promise I have something organized here. Let's see. There we go. So this is kind of a better example of how I would organize them. So here I will have contact sheets that I've exported from Lightroom. I'll have the final JPEGs optimized for the web. Here I have all the PSD files that I created, and here's the gigantic folder of raw images where I divided them here, since it was a really large shoot, into images that were selected and images that were not selected.
Okay, so just
Yeah.
seeing if I understand this. So you craft, like in your Explorer thing, in your files, you create your file structure like this, and then for Lightroom, you would just import the raw into Lightroom, and then you'd be able to kind of sort through it there. But you have already created the structure.
Exactly.
And then Lightroom, you're not using Lightroom to like access any of the Photoshop images. Like once you're done.
Right, no, I just use Lightroom purely as a way to kind of organize all of my files, because otherwise, since I shoot in RAW, each one is about like 40 megabytes, and so opening those up in any other software it'll just immediately freeze it and crash it. I might then make really broad, general type of adjustments in Lightroom, so things like exposure. If I wanted, say, I was doing like natural portraits outdoors, and I wanted everything to be a little bit more airy, I'd make that adjustment in Lightroom, make a contact sheet, send it to whoever's kind of the client who's selecting the images, and then from there, once they make their selection and narrow it down, I'll open those individual files up in Photoshop and make more specific corrections to it. So then, like doing skin retouching, etc., and so forth.
Did I hear you correctly? So you said you make this file structure here,
Mm-hmm.
and then you import these files or folders into Lightroom. But how are you viewing them to determine if they've made to these categories, to build these categories? Meaning, I guess I've always,
Yeah.
so the way that I've done it is I've always started with the import into Lightroom, and then that's how I decided what I throw away or what I keep and
okay.
prioritize.
Mhm.
So how are you viewing them?
For me, it's just, I guess we're kind of doing the same thing, just at different points. I go ahead and just import everything into Lightroom rather than going through and viewing them there, just because I like to use labels and the starring system. So I'll go through and do a first batch of, okay, all these images are in focus, 1 star. And sometimes I will throw things or take things out of my Lightroom catalog, but then I keep advancing from there. Mostly because that just helps me edit, is by using all of those starring and flagging systems. But I think, yeah, you just edit in the import dialog box. And yeah, so just a different way to do the same thing. Hopefully that answered your,
Just, so my interface has just really huge icons in it. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but when I'm in Photoshop, like the layers are huge right now, like just the layers menu. And I'm just wondering how you change it up, because actually in the class they're tiny and nobody can see anything. So right here.
Oh. So it's just a matter
Yeah, there.
Well, if you look at hers, do you see how small?
So this is, I don't have any system like this, but what I understand, I think I understand the concept, which is that you could figure out what organizational
So it doesn't matter, I mean, over here.
Right.
So if you wanted to have all your, it seems like she has her like raw files one place and her Photoshop files someplace else, just contact sheets, which I've never done. And then so she has
I
like
don't know,
whatever her
it's just
things
something
are.
that really comes up.
But then I think, you can choose where your photos.
There
are
were
saved.
English and stuff, so there's more.
So she creates a structure, because with Lightroom, once you
Okay.
import it, it's connected to like folder, and it's really specific. Like you have to either, I'm not an expert at, yeah, right, exactly, yeah. And so who wants to do that? Like you only do that if you have to. But it seems like if you created the structure already of however it is that you want your stuff, that you could then import it directly into that raw folder. And then knowing that, your system is that you have, the raw here and then the Photoshop here and then the contact sheets. Like for me, I think I have it all in the same folder. And it's just kind of, I definitely can think through what, I mean, not a commercial.
I'll write that
I
down.
don't need that level, right?
Yeah.
It was interesting, is that I was doing all sorts of different, adjustments that these never change, symbols never change.
Yeah, right. But I would be years for you to take the green structure that's yours and the big one
That's probably.
without having to go back on it.
Okay.
Make sure I really,
Thank you.
really understand what my options are and if that makes sense for me. It's
Oh, no, that's fine, you're welcome.
You've got to commit, and then there's a system.
I've been doing just a little bit because I've just been learning Photoshop. We use this. So if you're, oh gosh, I guess I have to be in Lightroom. If you're in Lightroom and
So are we supposed to save these on the desktop or just delete them and bring them next time?
I would, if you have a flash drive, save them to your own hard drive or save them, like upload them to your cloud. Because we do clean off the desktops. We try to do it once a week, so we can't guarantee that they're going to be here.
In